Hey guys, what's going on? So I just wanted to talk about some positional strategies, looking at the positions in terms of a points perspective. And for me, when I'm looking at a position by position basis, what really stands out is the quarterback, because while there may be some games where your quarterback does have a bad game and you have other players who can really uplift them, usually most of the time your quarterback is going to make the biggest contribution to your total score every week. And specifically when we're looking at last year or just in the past in general, there does appear to be a significant drop off between the top quarterbacks and then more of the mid-level quarterbacks. So I'd say especially if you aren't getting someone who definitely has the potential to be a top tier quarterback, you're really missing out by really going for a late round quarterback pick. But if you are counting on a specific quarterback to have a really good year and you think they're just really low in terms of their value on the draft, all power to you in that case. And then the other obvious thing that stands out to me is that you have a little bit more of a similarity in terms of just points between receivers and running backs, depending on who you're looking at. But I think there is still a contrast there. I'd say just a little bit more on average that running backs generally do have a higher average than wide receivers. And we do often see wide receivers going pretty high in the draft in comparison to running backs. If you're just looking at the first 12 or 24 picks, the majority of them are likely going to be receivers. So that's why I really like to target running backs early. And just on top of that, you're much more likely to find a decent wide receiver later in the draft in comparison to running backs, because most teams usually only have one main running back. You do have a few more teams doing more of a 50-50 split, but not nearly as many running backs as there are starting receivers, because you usually have two or even three solid guys per team. So I think there's just a lot more depth there, and really getting a lot of wide receivers early, in my opinion, regardless of who they are, isn't what's the best positional strategy in terms of getting the most possible points. And then the other thing, I think if we're talking about just positional scarcity in terms of running backs being more valuable than wide receivers, you would think this also would apply to tight ends. But in my opinion, I don't think tight ends are as really crucial. I think there's maybe the thought process that the drop off between the high end tight ends to mid round and even lower tier tight ends is pretty drastic, and I would agree that that definitely is the case. But if we're looking at tight ends, I'd say the point differential between a maybe good tight end and just an average isn't as drastic in comparison to the contrast between a good or mid-level quarterback. So I really don't think you're losing out on as many points by just skipping on those top level tight ends. And I'm going to give a few examples of this. So I think just a pretty good rule of thumb, although this might seem a little bit extreme, would be to get 3 of your running backs in the first 5 rounds. I would say filling in your flex with a wide receiver in comparison to a solid third running back really is going to be doing a disservice, because you're just not putting yourself in the right place in terms of just the positional value that you're going to get. If there is someone that you really like, and obviously there are wide receivers that do have higher averages than some running backs, that's totally fine. But I just think on average, just in terms of positions, you're losing out if you're not getting a good starting running back to fill in that flex spot. So that's why I think 3 running backs in the first 5 picks is something to pay attention to, or even you could push it to 6. But I think if we're really getting into the 6th and 7th round, that's really where a lot of those starting guys are falling off, or a lot of those strong number 2 running backs are no longer available, when you do have a lot of wide receivers that are still starting players available in these rounds. And in terms of really prioritizing that quarterback, because I think that's extremely important here, you really don't have a lot of quarterbacks, if any, available at this point. It also has to be said that quarterbacks that can rush a little bit too are usually doing a lot better in terms of total fantasy points. So in this case, in those top 5 picks, I would look for your quarterback in the middle somewhere, and then really just getting whatever running backs you can. And you could throw a wide receiver in there regardless. It could be maybe be the first pick, it could be the fourth pick. The point is that 4 out of 5 of these are really going to those crucial positions to really build a foundation. So just going to give a few examples of this. I'm just using a basic mock draft format. You do have a few different rankings in terms of what you're looking at, but I think this is really just to give an idea. So first off, I'm going to use just kind of a basic strategy, which would be just kind of looking at players and names and then just kind of going for more of those top ranking guys that are available. So starting off, this would be having the 5th pick in just a 12-team format. Let's say here I first picked Jamar Chase and then Deebo Samuel, and then I really saw that Sam Laporta was available and I wanted to grab him. And then 4th and 5th, I got Montgomery and Stevensons to fill in for my running backs. And then at this point, not a whole lot of running backs are as widely available, so I got George Pickens to fill in my flex. And then I wanted to get a quarterback. I didn't want to wait any longer, and I got CJ Stroud. So not taking into consideration your defense or kicker here, this would be my first 7 picks. And I think while on paper, this definitely is a good team, and this could make for a really great season. If we're looking at last year's averages and we're putting them in to assign a point value for what this team would be, that would come out to an average of 104.3 points per week. Again, this is just using the basic PPR format. And now we're going to compare this into doing the strategy I laid out, which is getting 3 running backs in the first 5 picks in addition to a quarterback. So now I also still have the 5th pick, but I'm not going to really look at the available rankings too much. I'm just going to really make sure I'm following this. So let's say in this case, then I picked up Jonathan Taylor first. I then got Josh Allen in the 2nd round, and then I went ahead and got Joe Mixon. I really liked Amari Cooper, so I just wanted to make sure I still have a wide receiver to hang out there. But then I got Mostert, and now I've checked off what I wanted to do. I have my 3 running backs. I have my really good potential quarterback. I also threw a wide receiver in there. I still want to grab a tight end because there's really not that many tight ends that are that promising. So in this case, I noticed that George Kittle is still available. And in this case, I'm going to grab him in the 6th round just to make sure I get him. And then I have my flex, but I still need 1 more wide receiver. And in this case, I do like George Pickens. And when we are assigning the statistics from last year to come up with a point value for this team, that would give a total of 112.3. So you have an 8 points difference here, and this is really being aggressive with this strategy. This is really drafting a lot lower than even where your pick would allow you to get, just in terms of the numerical rankings for these players. I think a crucial difference here is that while you are sacrificing those top-notch wide receivers, just looking at those averages, and you're maybe losing about just 3 points there, you are gaining almost 5 points in that quarterback with Josh Allen in comparison to CJ Stroud. But this is just based on last year's statistics. Of course, it's possible CJ Stroud has a really great year and Josh Allen doesn't, but this is really just to give a demonstration of drafting in terms of specific positions. So I'm going to do another example here just to test out this theory, and this is going to be a little bit later. So starting off, just kind of going in without that much of a clear strategy and just looking at the rankings and the names, I would get Wilson first, followed by Nakoa. Really 2 good strong receivers, and I really do like them both personally in the draft. And then I would again grab Laporta in the 3rd, followed by DJ Moore for my flex. And then I would get Devin Singletary for my first running back in addition to Warren. And then I would also wait until the 7th pick here to get my quarterback. In this instance, I would get Jordan Love. And this time, because I'm just going to give the benefit of the doubt to this first team, just based on last year's averages, I'm going to bump those up in a few different circumstances. So here I'm assuming that Wilson is going to have a much better year with Aaron Rodgers healthy. I'm going to bump him up from a 12.5 average to a 15 for this upcoming season. And then I'm also going to do the same for Singletary. I'm assuming since he's on the Giants, he's just going to get a lot more of a workload, and he's going to have an average of 12 points per game instead of the 9.8, which he came in last year. And same thing for Warren. I'm going to assume that he's going to turn it up a little bit more at Pittsburgh, and I'm bumping him up from an 11.6 to a 13 average, and then everyone else is going to stay the same there, but I'm keeping those same averages for this second team I'm drafting. And then when we are taking into consideration these numbers that I rounded up, you're getting a total of 107.4. And then going back to that strategy I laid out, also following the same pick, I would grab Barkley first, followed by Gibbs, getting really two strong running backs right off the top instead of wide receivers. Then instead of Josh Allen this time, I would wait and I would get Jalen Hurts in the third, followed by James Conner. And then I would fill in my wide receivers. I would get DJ Moore and Amari Cooper here. I was able to wait until the seventh to still grab George Kittle. So in this case, my total value based on last year's statistics would give me a total of 113.2. So even after bumping a few of those guys up, I still have a almost 5-point difference here in terms of my weekly average between these two teams. And while you are, again, losing just about a point or two due to not getting those receivers as high, you are gaining up for that by having 3 running backs in your starting lineup, in addition to having a much better quarterback with Jalen Hurts and a much better ceiling in terms of his weekly points. Again, you do have a lot of other factors to consider in terms of just specific players and their specific situations, whether it's a new team or new supporting players on their team. That obviously is really relevant, and then you might just be expecting certain guys to have better seasons or worse than where they were last year. So this definitely isn't everything, but I'd say just going back to thinking about it from a broad perspective, you really cannot deny that there are far more wide receivers in the draft total than there are running backs. So if you are waiting to fill out your running backs and you don't want to include one in a flex even, you're not really going to find those after the middle of the draft. There's really tons of wide receivers that you could still get that might even still be the wide receiver 1 for a given team really late in the draft, or even just certain guys that you think will likely have a good season. You could even get several wide receivers like that on your bench after doing your first 7 picks, and then they'll likely could become even one of your starting wide receivers later in the year. I think that's far more likely than predicting a certain rookie running back from having a really good season. And also, just taking another angle to look at this, it's far harder to pick up a really good running back throughout the season or a really good quarterback. I'd say that's really crucial regardless of any injuries that come up. But you can find a really good wide receiver. You can find really good tight ends from your free agencies as well. So that's my positional strategy for the draft. Feel free to let me know your strategies or thoughts. Really appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you later.